Is this some kind of joke? The voice was young, arrogant, and laced with the cheap confidence that comes from holding a black polymer rifle. It echoed slightly off the polished marble floors and high ceilings of the downtown bank lobby. The man holding the rifle, no older than 25, with a thin, patchy beard and eyes that darted like nervous insects, gestured with the barrel toward the old man who remained seated on a wooden bench while everyone else was either on the floor or behind the teller counter. I sat on the ground, watching as he snapped, "Grandpa, are you deaf or just stupid?" The old man didn't flinch. He simply looked up, his pale blue eyes clear and calm, holding a depth that seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the room. He wore a faded flannel shirt, worn denim jeans, and scuffed work boots, his gnarled, age-spotted hands resting on his knees, hands of a man who had worked with tools, with rope, with the very earth itself for a lifetime. He looked less like a threat and more like a piece of history accidentally left behind. "It's harder for me to get back up than it is to get down, son," the old man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble like stones turning over in a slow river. "I'll just stay put here, out of your way." The leader of the three-man crew, a man who called himself Cutter, strutted over. He was the one with the arrogant voice, fancying himself a professional, wearing clean tactical gear and moving with a practiced, if theatrical, swagger. He loomed over the old man, the rifle held casually across his chest. "See, that's the problem, Pops. You're not out of the way. You're a symbol of disobedience, and I can't have that." He smirked at his two accomplices, who nervously herded the bank manager toward the vault. "Now I'm going to ask you one last time. Get on the floor." The old man's gaze didn't waver. It wasn't defiant. It was analytical, patient. He was watching Cutter's trigger discipline, the way his weight was balanced, the slight tremor in his partner's hands as he fumbled with zip ties. He was taking in the acoustics of the room, the position of the security cameras, the scent of fierce sweat and cheap cologne coming off the young men. He was processing information, not reacting to a threat. This quiet refusal was a greater insult to Cutter's authority than any shouted defiance could ever be. It was as if the old man didn't even register him as a legitimate danger. Cutter's face tightened, the smirk vanishing. He reached down and grabbed the worn fabric of the old man's flannel shirt, yanking him forward. "You think you're special? You think the rules don't apply to you?" The old man's body was wiry and light, but he moved with a strange solidity, a rootedness that made the yank seem less effective than it should have been. He didn't stumble. He simply allowed the motion, his eyes never leaving Cutter's. "The rules apply to everyone," the old man said, his voice still impossibly calm. "Especially the one about picking your battles." The statement hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly baffling to Cutter. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the quiet certainty of a seasoned teacher correcting a student's math problem. This serene confidence was infuriating. Cutter shoved him back against the bench. "All right, old man. You want to be a hero? Fine, you can be our example." He turned to the hostages on the floor, their faces a mixture of terror and pity. "Everyone watch. This is what happens when you don't listen." He unslung his rifle, the metal scraping against his vest, and pointed it squarely at the old man's chest. The collective gasp from the hostages was sharp and sudden. A young woman began to sob quietly. The old man just sat there, his breathing slow and even. He looked at the barrel of the rifle not with fear, but with a kind of weary familiarity, as one might look at a tool they hadn't used in decades, but still remembered how to operate. The silence in the bank was suddenly heavy, broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the woman's quiet weeping. The old man was an island of stillness in a sea of panic. Cutter felt a surge of power, but it was tainted by a strange unease. He had expected fear, begging, compliance. He had not expected this profound and unsettling calm. It made him feel like the one who wasn't in control. Outside, A perimeter had been established. Unmarked vans and police cruisers formed a cordon 2 blocks in every direction. In a mobile command unit parked just out of sight, SWAT Commander Frank Thorne watched the bank's internal security feeds on a bank of monitors. He was a man in his late 50s with a face carved by years of stress and a reputation for methodical, unflappable leadership. "What's the status on the negotiator?" he asked his comms officer. "5 minutes out, sir," came the reply. Thorne grunted, his eyes fixed on the screen showing the main lobby. He saw the 3 armed men, the terrified hostages on the floor, and the one anomaly, the old man on the bench. "Who the hell is that?" Thorne muttered, leaning closer to the screen. "Why isn't he on the floor? Is he with them?" "Negative, sir," a tech analyst said, pulling up the bank's entry log data. "Facial recognition is running, but he's not in any criminal database. Looks like a civilian. Just stubborn." Thorne watched as Cutter, the clear leader, confronted the old man. He saw the shove, the rifle coming up. His own knuckles went white as he gripped the edge of his console. "Damn it," he breathed. "The kid's unstable. He's going to make an example out of him." Inside the bank, Cutter was getting more agitated by the second. The old man's tranquility was a mirror, reflecting his own insecurity and lack of control. "You got a death wish, old-timer," he snarled, pressing the barrel of the rifle into the soft fabric of the flannel shirt. "You want to meet your maker today?" The old man's eyes flickered down to the point of contact, then back up to Cutter's face. "Son," he said, his voice losing none of its quiet authority, "you press that trigger, and it'll be the last decision you ever make. Not because of me, but because of what comes after." It was another cryptic statement, another piece of a puzzle Cutter couldn't begin to solve. Was he a cop? An ex-military guy? He looked like a retired farmer. Cutter laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Oh, I'm shaking. What's going to come after? You going to haunt me?" He decided to escalate. Humiliation was often more effective than fear. He grabbed the old man by his thin arm and hauled him to his feet. He was surprisingly strong, his grip like weathered steel. He shoved him toward the center of the room. "On your knees, hands behind your head now." The old man didn't move. He simply stood there, his posture slightly stooped but his feet planted as if they'd grown out of the marble floor. He was looking past Cutter now, his gaze distant, unfocused. The pressure, the shouting, the immediate threat, it had triggered something. For a fleeting second, the polished lobby dissolved. He wasn't in a bank. He was in a damp, stinking cell, the air thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and metallic blood. The cold circle of a pistol barrel was pressed against his temple, not a rifle to his chest. A voice was screaming at him in a language he understood all too well, demanding names, locations, frequencies. He could feel the familiar icy calm descending, the slowing of his own heart, the heightened awareness that precedes violence. His body remembered this feeling, this precipice. It was an old familiar friend. He blinked. The image vanished. He was back in the bank. Cutter's face was inches from his, contorted in a mask of rage. "Did you hear me?" The old man's gaze refocused, clear and sharp as fractured ice. The brief journey into his past had settled him even further. The fear he should have been feeling was an emotion he'd misplaced somewhere in a Southeast Asian jungle half a century ago. "I heard you," he said softly. This was the final straw. Cutter's theatrical professionalism shattered, revealing the scared, angry young man beneath. He shoved the old man hard, making him stumble. Then with a guttural roar of frustration, he pressed the cold muzzle of his rifle against the old man's graying temple. "Last chance, you stubborn old fool." In the command van, Thorne saw the move and his blood ran cold. "He's going to execute him," he said, his voice grim. He grabbed a radio. "Sniper teams, do you have a shot?" "Negative, sir," a voice crackled back. Hostage is blocking a clean line. Thorne slammed his hand on the console. His eyes were glued to the monitor, zooming in on the old man's face, trying to understand the suicidal calm he saw there. Then he saw it. As Cutter shoved him, the old man's sleeve had ridden up his forearm, revealing a faded tattoo. It was blurry on the low-resolution feed, but the shape was unmistakable. A trident, an eagle, an anchor, a seal trident. But there was something else, something small and dark in the center of it. A black star. Thorne felt the air leave his lungs. It couldn't be. Zoom in, Thorne commanded, his voice tight. Enhance the feed on the subject's left forearm. The image pixelated, then resolved. It was still blurry but clear enough. A U.S. Navy SEAL trident, faded by decades of sun and salt. And there, right in the center, was the small, crudely rendered black star. Thorne felt a wave of disbelief followed by a surge of ice-cold dread, far more intense than anything the bank robbers inspired. There was only one unit, a ghost unit from the darkest days of Vietnam, that used that marking. They were a legend, a myth whispered about in hushed tones at Quantico and Coronado. They were the men they sent when they couldn't send anyone else. They officially didn't exist, and they were all supposed to be dead. "Oh my God," Thorne whispered, stumbling back a step from the... He was pale, his hands shaking slightly. He wasn't just managing a hostage crisis anymore. He was trying to prevent a catastrophe of a completely different kind. The phone on the bank manager's desk began to ring, a shrill, piercing sound that cut through the tension. Cutter's accomplice, the one guarding the manager, answered it, holding the receiver to his ear, and then passing it to Cutter. "It's the cops," he hissed. Cutter snatched the phone, a triumphant sneer returning to his face. "This is my show," he barked into the receiver. "You have 60 seconds to tell me why I shouldn't paint the walls with this old man's brains." The voice on the other end was not a negotiator's. It was tight, strained, and filled with a desperate authority. "Listen to me very carefully," Commander Thorne said, his voice cutting like glass. "You are not in control of that situation. You have no idea who you are dealing with. I am ordering you for your own safety to put your weapon on the floor and back away from that man." Cutter laughed. "Your orders? You think I take orders from you? You don't understand." Thorne pleaded, his professionalism dissolving into raw urgency. "You have a gun to the head of Silas Vance. Does that name mean anything to you?" The name meant nothing to Cutter. "Should it?" he mocked. "Is he your dad? Your favorite grandpa?" But Thorne wasn't talking to him anymore. He was almost shouting, hoping the man himself could hear. "Master Chief Vance, this is Commander Thorne, U.S. Navy. We have the building surrounded. Sir, if you can hear me, please do not engage. I repeat, do not engage. We are standing down." The term Master Chief and the deferential sir were so utterly out of place that they confused everyone. The other robbers looked at Cutter, their own bravado beginning to crack. The hostages stared, bewildered. Silas Vance, the old man, closed his eyes for a moment, a flicker of something regret perhaps, or weariness crossing his face. The quiet life he had so carefully built was about to be shattered. Cutter, however, just grew more enraged. "What is this? Some kind of trick? You think you can psych me out?" He pressed the gun harder against Silas's temple. "You're all going to die for this." Thorne's voice came back, laced with a new kind of terror. "I'm telling you, son, that man is a ghost. He's a living legend. Look at his arm. Look at the tattoo. The black star in the center of that trident. Do you know what that means?" There was a pause. Cutter, despite himself, glanced down at the old man's forearm. He saw the faded ink. It looked like any other cheap military tattoo. "It means he's an old sailor," he sneered. "No." Thorne's voice was barely a whisper now, a ghost on the line. It means he was part of MSCVS, OG's Naval Advisory Detachment. They were called the Trident Zero Unit. They went places SEALs weren't allowed to go. They did things no one would ever talk about. Officially, they never existed. Unofficially, they won battles by themselves. That man, that old man you have your gun pointed at, he has more confirmed kills than most battalions. He was captured 3 times and escaped 3 times. The last time he walked 200 miles through enemy jungle, carrying 2 wounded comrades. They have a medal named after him that they can't tell anyone about. You don't have a gun to a hostage, son. You have a gun to a national monument. The silence that followed Thorne's words was absolute. It was deeper and heavier than any silence the bank had known before. The hum of the ventilation seemed to fade away. The quiet sobbing had stopped. Every person in the room, hostage and robber alike, was staring at the unassuming old man in the flannel shirt. Cutter's arm began to tremble. His mind struggled to connect the terrifying description on the phone with the frail-looking figure in front of him. He looked into Silas Vance's pale blue eyes, and for the first time, he saw past the wrinkles and the age. He saw the unsettling calm not as weakness, but as a terrifying form of control. He saw a patience forged in trials he couldn't possibly imagine. The eyes weren't just looking at him. They were assessing him, weighing him, and finding him wanting. The rifle in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. The old man Silas slowly reached up with one of his gnarled hands. It wasn't a sudden move. It was deliberate, calm, and non-threatening. He didn't grab the rifle. He gently placed his fingers over the muzzle, his touch surprisingly warm against the cold steel. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice still a low, quiet rumble. "He's right. You're in over your head. But it doesn't have to end badly for you." Cutter flinched back as if he'd been burned, snatching the rifle away. He stared at his own hand, then at Silas, his face ashen. The illusion of his power had been completely and irrevocably shattered. He was a child pointing a toy gun at a god of war. His 2 accomplices had already dropped their weapons. They were staring at Silas with a mixture of awe and pure terror, their hands raised in the air. The bank robbery was over. It had been over the moment Commander Thorne had spoken that name. Cutter let out a choked sound, a cross between a sob and a gasp, and the rifle clattered from his nerveless fingers onto the marble floor. He stumbled backwards, his legs giving way, and collapsed into a sitting position, his head in his hands. He had come in to rob a bank to be a powerful man. Instead, he had blundered into a history lesson he would never forget. He had threatened a ghost, and the experience had broken him. The SWAT team entered not with a dynamic breach, but with a quiet, almost reverent procession. They moved with purpose, securing the trembling robbers and immediately beginning to release the hostages. But their leaders, 2 heavily armed officers in full tactical gear, walked directly to Silas. They stopped a respectful distance away. One of them, a younger man, instinctively brought his hand up in a crisp salute before catching himself and lowering it, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Sir," the lead officer said, his voice muffled by his helmet, "are you all right?" Silas simply nodded, his eyes scanning the room, ensuring the other hostages were being cared for. He seemed more concerned for them than for himself. He walked over to the young woman who had been sobbing and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's over now," he said. "You're safe." He was no longer a target or a legend. He was just a kind old man comforting a scared civilian. Paramedics rushed in, but he waved them away, then sat back down on the same wooden bench where it had all started, the very picture of unassuming normalcy. Outside, the scene was one of controlled chaos, but as Silas was escorted out, a strange quiet fell over the assembled officers and agents. They parted for him, creating a path. Commander Thorne met him at the door of the mobile command unit. Out of his uniform jacket, tie loosened, his face etched with profound relief and awe. He didn't offer a handshake. He simply stood straight and gave a slow, formal nod. "Master Chief Vance," Thorne said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's an honor." Silas looked at the commander, then at the young, terrified face of Cutter being led away in handcuffs. The boy looked broken, his life ruined. Silas turned back to Thorne. "That boy," he said, his voice low, "he's young. He made a stupid mistake. Don't let this one mistake be the end of his road. See if you can get him into a program. Maybe the service. Teach him what real strength is." Thorne was stunned. After being threatened, humiliated, and having a gun pressed to his head, this man's first instinct was not vengeance, but mercy. It was a level of grace that Thorne could barely comprehend. "Sir, after what he did," he began, but Silas interrupted gently. "He's just a scared kid who thought a gun made him a man. He needs a teacher, not a cage. Don't we owe that to them to try?" Months later, a young man with a shaved head and a stiff new uniform was mopping the floors of a mess hall at a Marine Corps recruit depot. It was grueling, thankless work, part of a plea deal that had seen him avoid a long prison sentence in exchange for military enlistment. It had been Commander Thorne who had pulled every string he had, honoring the old man's request. The young man, the one who used to call himself Cutter, worked with a quiet intensity, his face stripped of its former arrogance. He was learning a new kind of discipline, one that came from within, not from the barrel of a gun. One afternoon, an officer told him he had a visitor. He walked into a small, sterile waiting room and saw him. Silas Vance was sitting on a plastic chair, wearing the same kind of simple, practical clothes as before. He looked just as old, just as unremarkable, but the young recruit now saw him for what he was. He immediately snapped to attention, his back ramrod straight. "Sir," he said, his voice clear and respectful. Silas smiled, a small, gentle expression, stood up and walked over. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He just looked the young man in the eye, and the recruit saw no judgment, no anger, only a quiet encouragement. "I hear you're doing well," Silas said. "Work hard. Learn everything they teach you. Be a man your family can be proud of." The recruit could only nod, his throat too tight to speak. Silas placed a hand on his shoulder, the same gnarled, powerful hand that had rested on the end of his rifle. The touch was firm, steady. "Your life isn't over," the old SEAL said. "It's just beginning. Don't waste the second chance you've been given." With that, Silas turned and left. The young man stood at attention long after the old veteran had gone, tears streaming down his face. He had faced down a legend and survived, not because of his own strength, but because of the legend's grace. He would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of it. And Silas Vance went back to his quiet life, a ghost walking among the living. His war long over, his service never ending. A silent testament to the fact that the most dangerous men are often the ones who have nothing left to prove. They carry their valor not on their sleeves but in the quiet chambers of their hearts, ready to offer mercy where others would only seek revenge.